February had come off Lake Coeur d'Alene fast. Theo Marsh was 40 minutes up the ridge trail when Rue stopped and turned off the main path without command. She did not look back. Below a switchback sat a woman on an iced log, coat too thin, small dog pressed against her, phone face down beside her. She had spent her last dollar on dog food. She had $7.83 in her account and a folded piece of paper in her pocket. What that Marine and his K9 found on that ridge would reach deeper than a rescue, and what it cost this 76-year-old woman to be found would change them both. If this is your first time here, stay with this one. Subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of story this channel was made for. Theo Marsh had been a scout sniper with the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, which meant his training had given him, among other things, the ability to hold still in a position of observation for longer than felt natural, to see what a scene was before it saw him back, and to notice the things that were almost right, rather than the things that were obviously wrong. He was from Billings, had joined at 18, had come home at 28 with a body that still knew how to be perfectly still, and a mind that had learned, in 2 tours of Helmand Province, what the moment before something breaks actually looks like. He had moved to Coeur d'Alene 6 months ago, in part because the lake and the ridgelines and the particular quality of February light reminded him of the mountains outside Billings, and in part because his spotter, Danny Ferreira, had grown up here and had told him there were trails worth the drive, and in part because after 3 years in Billings following his sister Addie's crisis he had needed, for reasons he could not entirely articulate, to be somewhere that didn't contain the specific geography of the worst night of his life. Addie was 22 now. She had been 19 when the call came. She was okay, had been okay for 2 years in the steady, committed way that okay is a practice rather than a state. And Theo visited her every month and called every Sunday, and had gradually learned to hold the worry at a volume that did not take up all the room. But the hours before she was found, the hours when her phone went to voicemail and Theo was 3 time zones away, and the specific arithmetic of unanswered calls had been adding up in his chest. Those hours had given him something that could not be unlearned. He knew what a person who has decided to stop looks like from the outside. He knew it doesn't look like a crisis. He knew it looks like someone going about their ordinary life, just more quietly than usual. He had learned this the hardest way. He had not been able to unlearn it since. Rue had come to him through a program in Missoula. She was red brindle, built long and deep through the chest, with the particular unhurried movement of a dog that has decided it is in no rush, because it already knows where it is going. She had been named by the program coordinator, a small joke about her origins as a stray found somewhere with a French street name, and Theo had kept the name because she had already learned it, and because, once you saw her run a ridgeline at dawn with her nose down and her ears back and her whole body committed to whatever she was tracking, the name seemed not wrong. She had what Theo could only describe as seriousness. Not the anxious seriousness of a dog that has learned the world is unsafe, but the considered seriousness of a dog that has assessed the world and decided to pay it full attention. She had been wrong about nothing in 2 years. He had stopped requiring explanations. Margaret Callahan had been a letter carrier for 38 years in Coeur d'Alene, walking the same route in rain and ice and the particular August heat that came off the asphalt on the residential blocks near Sherman Avenue. And she had known, by the end of the first decade, every household on her route by its patterns. Which porch lights came on at what hour, which mailboxes filled and were cleared, and which ones accumulated in ways that indicated trouble. Which doors opened when they heard her step because the person inside was waiting for something. She had delivered the world to her route for 38 years and had known, in the intimate way of a person who shows up every day, whether the day is convenient or not, what that kind of steady presence means to people who have no other reliable visitor. Her name was Midge to everyone who knew her. And everyone knew her. She had married Frank Callahan in 1975 at St. Thomas Church on Lakeside Avenue, and she had been married to him for 45 years, and had known, for most of those years, that she had gotten the better end of an arrangement that Frank also believed he had gotten the better end of, which was the particular quality of a marriage that works. Frank had been a house painter who sang bass in a barbershop quartet, and who had the specific gift of people who are genuinely interested in everyone they meet, not performatively, not professionally, but with the actual desire to know what a person is about. He had died of pancreatic cancer 11 weeks after diagnosis, in October 3 years ago. Because that is how that cancer goes, it announces itself when it is already finished, and the interval between the announcement and the end is just long enough to be precise about what is being lost. Midge had been at his side for all 11 weeks. She had learned, in those weeks, what her arithmetic without him looked like, and she had not liked the numbers. The pension was built for 2 and paid for 1. The apartment was fine on combined income and not fine on Frank's pension alone, which was what remained after the 11 weeks had been paid for: the hospital, the specialists, the specific expensive machinery of a modern death, none of which was bad care, and all of which cost what it cost, and left what it left. She was not destitute in the way that word usually implies. She was in the situation of a person who had done everything right and arrived somewhere wrong anyway, which is a different kind of hardship, because it leaves you without a clear error to correct. She had a dog named Biscuit, a beagle mix, 12 years old, white-muzzled and slow on cold mornings, who had been Frank's dog first and was now the last living thing that had also loved Frank and that still needed something from Midge every day. The need was small: food, walks, the particular warmth of a sleeping dog against the legs on the nights when the apartment was cold, because Midge had the thermostat set at 59 to keep the bill manageable. Biscuit did not know any of this. Biscuit knew where his bowl was and where Midge's feet were, and that these two things were the whole of what was required of him, which was the uncomplicated loyalty that Midge had come to understand as one of the 2 or 3 things in her life that still felt like evidence of something worth staying for. The $7.83 in her checking account was what remained after the rent partial she had paid, and the electric bill, and the bag of dog food she had bought on Tuesday from the discount bin at the grocery on 4th Street. She had $7.83, and the rent was due in 8 days, and she had not told Craig. Craig was her son. He lived in Spokane, called on Sundays, sent $200 a month, and believed this was what was needed, because Midge had never told him otherwise. She had not told him because telling him would require explaining how far things had gone, and explaining how far things had gone would require a conversation she had been postponing for 3 years. Because once it was said, it could not be unsaid, and she was not ready to be that kind of burden to her son. She had been to see her doctor in December. Not for her body. Her body was as it was, the usual inventory of a 76-year-old who had walked a mail route for 38 years and whose joints knew it. For the other thing. The thing that had been getting heavier since November. The specific gravity of a winter spent doing arithmetic that always came out the same way. The doctor had given her a referral, and she had not made the appointment, because making the appointment would have required telling Frank's insurance carrier that she was seeing a mental health professional, and the carrier would have required a copay she did not currently have, and this was not, she had decided, a problem she was able to solve today. She had told herself she was going for a walk. She and Biscuit had walked the ridge trail above the lake since 1993, since before Frank proposed to her on this trail, in fact, which was a detail she had not shared with anyone because it seemed too large to hold in casual conversation and too private to explain to someone who hadn't been there. She had Biscuit on his leash. She had Frank's canvas barn coat because hers was in the dry cleaner, and because wearing Frank's coat on difficult days had become a practice she did not interrogate. She had her phone in the pocket. She had walked 2 miles up before the squall came. She had not, in so many words, told herself what she was walking toward. The cold came in fast off the lake. The trail iced. Biscuit went stiff the way old dogs go stiff in cold, not limping, just slowing. The cold reaching into his joints before it reached into hers. She had sat down on a log to pick him up and warm him for a moment, and she had not gotten back up, and Biscuit had settled against her, and she had looked out through the trees at the gray nothing of the squall over the water, and she had thought about Frank and about the $7.83, and about the copay she couldn't afford, and about the referral she hadn't called, and about whether any of it was going to change in any direction that mattered. And she had not come up with an answer she found convincing. She had reached into Frank's coat and taken out the folded paper from the breast pocket and held it in her lap with the hand she had not put back in her pocket. She did not read it. She had written it, and she knew what it said. Rue found Biscuit's scent first and followed it off the main trail into the switchback below the ridge. Then she found the other thing, the quality of stillness that is not the stillness of rest. The specific human signature of a person who has stopped in the way that means something different from tired. She did not bark. She turned and went toward it at a pace that was faster than her usual trail pace and not quite running. And Theo followed without speaking because Rue's pace was the only instruction he needed. He saw the coat first. Then the dog pressed against the coat. Then the woman inside it, her hands in her lap, the folded paper visible, the phone face down on the log beside her as though she had turned it over deliberately so that the screen was not something she had to look at. She looked at him when he arrived. She looked at him the way a person looks when they have been alone with something heavy for a long time and are not sure, yet whether another person's presence is a relief or an additional weight to manage. He said, "You're cold." He made it a statement, not a question, because he had been trained to state what he could observe and ask only what he couldn't. She said, "I sat down to warm my dog." He said, "I know." He sat down on the log beside her and put his jacket around her shoulders over the barn coat, and Rue lay down across Biscuit, and Biscuit, who had never met Rue in his life, did not object. Because cold dogs accept warmth from whatever direction it comes. Have you ever known someone like Midge? Someone who carried everything alone not because they lacked people who loved them, but because they had decided, quietly and without telling anyone, that they were more cost than they were worth? If that person is still here, reach out today. Not this weekend. Today, if they're not, tell me about them in the comments. They deserve to be remembered. He took his phone out. 1 bar of signal, 9% battery. He called search and rescue before he called anyone else, because that was the order of operations, and gave them the trail coordinates and the condition of the trail and the woman's temperature. He put his palm against her cheek, briefly, and she let him, which told him something about how cold she was, and something about how alone she had been. And then the call dropped, and the phone battery died, and he put the phone back in his pocket and looked at the trail, and looked at Rue, and understood that whatever happened next was going to happen with what was here. The paper was still in her lap. She had not put it back. He looked at it. He looked at her. She was watching him with the expression of a person who has been found doing something they cannot explain and is waiting to understand what the finding means. He said, without looking away, "Can I keep that safe for you while we walk out?" She did not answer immediately. She looked at the paper, and then at the dog, and then at him. Then she held it out. He put it in his shirt pocket, close to his chest, where it would stay warm and dry. He could not carry both Midge and Biscuit out. He fashioned a carry for Biscuit from his jacket and Rue's lead, which left him with one arm for Midge on the iced trail. And they walked the 2 miles to the trailhead in an hour and 6 minutes, which was not fast and was fast enough. Because when he heard the search and rescue vehicle on the fire road at the bottom, he understood that the coordinates had gone through before the phone died. The squall was still coming. They made the trailhead as the trail became something that could not be walked. The EMT who took Midge's temperature at the vehicle said, "Another 40 minutes up there and we're having a different conversation." Theo heard this and thought about Addie and did not say what he was thinking because the situation did not require it. If you were sitting in that search and rescue vehicle, knowing what Theo was beginning to understand about why Midge had sat down on that log, would you have done what he did next? Type yes or no. I read every one. At the hospital, when Midge was warm and the hypothermia was being treated and she was awake enough to look at him with the full version of her face rather than the reduced version that cold produces, he asked if he could read the letter. Not to anyone else, just to know. She said yes. He read it while she watched. And Rue had her chin on the hospital bed, and Biscuit was in a blanket in the chair, and the letter was to Biscuit. A short letter, clear and unsentimental, in the way that Midge's speech was clear and unsentimental, telling the dog that the walks had been the best part, that Frank had loved him first, and she had loved him because of Frank, and then on his own merits, and that what was going to happen was not his fault, and that someone would take care of him. Theo set the letter down on the bed between them. He said, "Who's the someone?" She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she said, "I hadn't gotten that far." He said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "You found me on a mountain. You can ask." He said, "What's the arithmetic?" And she told him. The whole of it. The pension, the 11 weeks, the $7.83, the rent, the copay, Craig and the $200, and why she hadn't told him. The referral she hadn't called. She told him in the flat, precise voice of a woman who had been a letter carrier for 38 years and knew that some information simply needed to be delivered. He listened without speaking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'm going to call someone. Not to fix everything. Just to start the list. Is that okay?" She said yes. Then she said, to the window, not to him, in the quiet of a woman saying something she has been keeping for a long time, "I just didn't want Biscuit to not know." She had written the letter to a dog. She had walked up a trail in Frank's coat with 1 bar of battery and a piece of paper folded in the breast pocket so it would be found. She had not called Craig. She had not called the crisis line on the referral she hadn't called. She had written a letter to a dog because Biscuit was the one she was most afraid of leaving without explanation. And that sentence, when you hold it next to the $7.83 and the copay and the 3 years of arithmetic that always came out wrong, tells you everything about the specific place a person has to arrive before they stop believing they are worth the explanation to anyone who can actually answer back. Rue had not found a woman who was lost. She had found a woman who was done. The room held that. Craig drove from Spokane in under 2 hours. He arrived to find Theo in the chair beside his mother's bed, and Rue on, the floor between the chair and the door, and Biscuit in his blanket, and his mother awake and warmer, and looking at him with the particular expression of a woman who has decided that the conversation she has been postponing is now simply happening. Rue watched Craig enter. She assessed him with the sustained amber attention she gave to anything entering a space she had decided to watch over. And she did not place herself between Craig and Midge. This was not a threat. She had already decided that. But she did not move from the floor between the chair and the door either, and her presence there was its own kind of statement. Craig looked at his mother. He looked at Theo. He looked at the room, the arrangement of it, the man in the chair who was not family and had clearly been there for hours, the dog on the floor in its attentive position, his mother in the bed with the expression of a woman who has passed through something and is now on the other side of it. He said his mother's name. She said his. He sat on the edge of the bed and reached for her hand, and she let him take it, and what passed between them in the next few minutes was not everything that needed to be said. That conversation would take weeks and months, and the particular patience of a family reopening rooms it had been keeping closed. But it was the beginning of saying it, and beginning was sufficient. Theo stayed through the beginning. Then he got up to leave. Midge stopped him at the door. She said the letter. "I want it back." He gave it to her. She folded it carefully and set it on the bedside table, and she looked at it for a moment. And then she said, "I'm going to need to write a different ending." He said, "I know. I'll come by Thursday." He called Danny Ferreira from the parking lot to say he was going to miss their Thursday run. Danny asked why. Theo said he had a standing visit on Thursday now. Danny said, "With who?" Theo told him. Danny was quiet for a moment and then said, "Midge Callahan." "My mom knows Midge Callahan. She's in her book club." And Theo stood in the hospital parking lot in the February cold and thought about Ray Cobb and Dottie Cobb, and the specific way that the world keeps turning out to be smaller and more connected than the size of the grief inside it makes it feel. And he thought about Addie, who was in Billings and was okay. And he thought about the 38 years Midge had walked her route in all weather, and the specific kind of person that kind of showing up makes you. And he thought, she knew how to deliver things to people who were waiting for something. She just hadn't known that she was one of them. There are things that look like ordinary life from the outside. A walk, a coat, a small dog on a leash, that are not ordinary life from the inside. The difference between those two views is not visible from the trail. It is visible from the bench on the log, from the face-down phone, from the letter in the breast pocket folded to be found. Theo had been trained to see the 95% version of a thing, the version that is almost right, and therefore harder to identify than the version that is obviously wrong. He had been trained for war. He had not been trained for this specific ridge. He had simply been the person on it. She had been worth finding the whole time. The crisis line number is 988. Midge did not call it that day, but she called it the following week, and she made the appointment, and the copay was covered under the provision she had not known about, and that Danny's mother, Rita, found in 20 minutes, because finding those provisions was what Rita's peer support work had trained her to do. The rent was addressed through a Veterans Family Emergency Fund that Theo did not know existed before he started looking, and found it in 4 days. Because he had been trained to find things that were almost hidden, and the fund was not hiding. It was simply not being asked for. Craig started calling on Thursdays too. Not to check in. To talk. There is a difference. And Midge knew it. And after a while, Craig could hear that she knew it in the way she answered the phone. Biscuit went on sleeping against Midge's legs on the cold nights, which were fewer now that the thermostat was set at a temperature that could be called warm without qualification. He did not know about any of this. He knew where his bowl was and where Midge's feet were, and that these two things had always been sufficient and remained so. He was 12 years old, and he was warm, and Midge was beside him, and whatever else had been true on the ridge above the lake, this was also true, and it was enough to build on. There are people deciding right now whether they are worth the interruption of someone else's ordinary day. The answer is yes. The answer is always yes. Sometimes the trail is iced and the phone is at 9%, and the squall is coming, and the only thing standing between that answer and the wrong conclusion is a dog who turned off the main path because something in the cold needed finding. She simply sat down in the place where she could be found. This story is for every person who has written a letter they were hoping someone would read in time. You are worth the finding. And this story is for anyone walking a trail in February who feels a dog pull toward the ridge. Follow her. She already knows. Is there a midge in your life? Someone you haven't checked on in a while, not because you don't care, but because you trusted the silence? Tell me about them in the comments. Let's fill this section with the names of people who deserve to be found sooner. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here for the next one. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.